Picture a woman who wielded power like no other in medieval Europe, twice a queen, a patron of the arts, and a master of political chess. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't just a ruler, she was a force of nature, bending the turbulent 12th century to her will. Born into immense wealth as Duchess of Aquitaine, she became Queen of France and then Queen of England, navigating a world where men held the swords, but she held the strategy. Her life was a tapestry of scandal, rebellion, and brilliance, a story so dramatic it feels ripped from a novel. Yet every twist, every whispered rumor, every bold move was real. This is the woman who inspired troubadours, defied kings, and left a legacy so enduring it still captivates us today. Step into the opulent courts of medieval Europe, where power was a dangerous game and alliances shifted like shadows. Imagine the flickering torchlight of a grand hall, the scent of incense thick in the air as Eleanor moved through the crowd, her presence commanding attention. Here was a woman who refused to fade into the background, whether she was orchestrating a rebellion against her own husband or riding bare-breasted into the Crusades, according to legends that still spark debate. Her love life alone could fill volumes: a divorce from the King of France, a passionate and volatile marriage to Henry Roman II of England, and sons who would become kings themselves. But behind the glamour and the gossip lay a razor-sharp mind, a ruler who understood the weight of diplomacy and the art of survival in an age where women were seldom given the reins. Yet for all we know about Eleanor, mysteries still linger in the corners of history. Whispers of secret alliances, lost letters, and untold schemes swirl around her name. Why did she risk everything to support her son's revolt against Henry? What truly happened during her captivity? Was it imprisonment or a tactical retreat? And how did she maintain her influence well into her 70s, long after most medieval women were sidelined? This is more than just the tale of a queen. It's a journey into the heart of medieval power where love and war, betrayal and cunning shaped the fate of nations. So settle in, because the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine is about to unfold, and it's far stranger, bolder, and more thrilling than you've ever heard. Eleanor of Aquitaine entered the world in the year 1122, not as just another noble child, but as the daughter of a dynasty that controlled lands wealthier than the French crown itself. The House of Poitiers ruled over Aquitaine, a region stretching across modern-day southwestern France, a land of vineyards, bustling ports, and troubadours whose songs celebrated love and chivalry. From her earliest years, Eleanor was immersed in the vibrant Occitan culture, where women held more autonomy than anywhere else in Europe, and art flourished alongside politics. Her father, Duke William X, ensured she received an education fit for a future ruler: literature, Latin, diplomacy, even the intricacies of law and governance. Then, in one devastating turn, everything changed. When Eleanor was just 15, her father died suddenly during a pilgrimage, leaving her as the sole heir to Aquitaine. Overnight, this teenager became the most powerful unmarried woman in Europe, her lands a prize that could tilt the balance of power on the continent. Aquitaine wasn't just rich, it was the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, a region so strategically vital that kings would scheme, fight, and even go to war for control of it. And now it all rested in the hands of a young girl who had just stepped onto history's stage. But inheritance in the medieval world was never simple, especially for a woman. Without a male heir, Aquitaine's future hinged on Eleanor's marriage, and the French king, Louis VI, saw his chance. He swiftly arranged for her to wed his own son, the future Louis VII, binding her vast territories to the French crown. It was a political masterstroke, yet few could have guessed how this union would unravel, or how Eleanor would turn the tables in ways no one expected. For now, though, she was a chess piece in a game much larger than herself, a game she would soon learn to play better than anyone else. Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII was less a fairy tale and more a collision of worlds. The young French prince, raised in the shadow of monasteries and schooled in piety, was utterly unprepared for the whirlwind that was his new queen. While Parisian courtiers clutched their rosaries and whispered prayers, Eleanor filled the halls with troubadours singing of courtly love, a concept so scandalous to the French clergy they called it heresy. Aquitaine's vibrant culture clashed with the drab rigidity of Paris, where even laughter seemed muted. But the real rupture came during the Second Crusade, a campaign that would lay bare every fault line in their marriage. When Louis answered the church's call to retake Jerusalem, Eleanor didn't just accompany him. She arrived with a retinue of Aquitanian knights and ladies, turning the holy war into a spectacle. Dressed in armor said to gleam like silver, she rode at the head of her own troops, a queen leading not from some distant palace but from the saddle. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Louis, agonizing over every decision as if heaven itself kept score, while Eleanor strategized with the confidence of a ruler who knew her own mind. Then came Antioch, where her uncle Raymond ruled, a charismatic prince who shared Eleanor's love of poetry, politics, and perhaps, according to venomous chroniclers, far more. The rumors spread like wildfire. Eleanor and Raymond were said to spend hours debating military tactics behind closed doors, a scandal in an era when even innocent meetings needed chaperones. Worse, she openly supported Raymond's plan to strike at Muslim strongholds in Syria, rather than march blindly to Jerusalem, a rational strategy Louis rejected. When he ordered her to follow him south, she allegedly threatened annulment on grounds of consanguinity, a legal bombshell that would haunt them later. Whether their rift was political, romantic, or both, one thing was clear: the Crusade shattered whatever fragile bond they'd built. By the time they limped back to France in disgrace, their marriage was a husk. The aftermath was brutal. Humiliated by military failure and gossip, Louis grew colder, while Eleanor chafed under the suffocating norms of Parisian life. Even childbirth, a daughter, Marie, then a second, Alex, failed to mend the rift. In a court where queens were expected to be silent and obedient, Eleanor's brilliance became a liability. By the time she met Henry Plantagenet, the fiery young Duke of Normandy whose ambition mirrored her own, the stage was set for one of history's most dramatic divorces, and a remarriage that would redraw the map of Europe. But that's another chapter in the legend of Eleanor of Aquitaine. The annulment that severed Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Louis VII wasn't just a private heartbreak, it was a political earthquake. By the spring of 1152, their union had become a spectacle of dysfunction, whispered about in cathedral cloisters and royal courts alike. The official reason: consanguinity, the claim that they were too closely related by blood, a convenient legal loophole in an age where noble marriages were often tangled webs of kinship. But everyone knew the truth. This was a marriage gutted by incompatibility, military failure, and Eleanor's refusal to shrink into the shadows. What made the scandal even juicier were the rumors swirling around Eleanor's supposed infertility. After nearly 15 years of marriage, she'd borne only 2 daughters, no male heir to secure the French throne. In a world where queens were valued first as royal wombs, this was ammunition for her critics. Chroniclers, many of them monks with little love for assertive women, painted her as barren or even cursed, but the truth was far more complex. Eleanor's daughters proved she could conceive, and later, with Henry, she'd deliver 5 healthy sons. The infertility narrative was likely a smear campaign, a way to justify Louis's desperation to rid himself of a wife who'd become a liability. Then came the most astonishing twist: Eleanor walked away from the annulment with her birthright intact. Under medieval law, a woman's lands typically reverted to her husband upon marriage, yet Aquitaine remained hers, a staggering exception that speaks volumes about her political savvy. Some historians believe her father's foresight ensured her inheritance was ironclad. Others think Louis, perhaps guilt-ridden or politically outmaneuvered, agreed to the terms. Either way, Eleanor emerged not as a disgraced queen but as a sovereign duchess, her territories restoring her power in an instant. Louis likely expected her to fade into quiet obscurity. Instead, within weeks, she was racing south to Poitiers, dodging kidnapping attempts by lords eager to seize her lands or her hand. One count even ambushed her party, forcing her to flee in disguise. But Eleanor wasn't just running from danger, she was sprinting toward her next act. By summer, she'd marry Henry Plantagenet, a man 11 years her junior whose ambition burned as brightly as her own. Together, they'd forge an empire stretching from Scotland to Spain and unleash a new era of drama that would make her first marriage look like a courtly ballad. The annulment wasn't an ending, it was the prologue to Eleanor's greatest power play. Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Henry Plantagenet wasn't just a union of hearts, it was a seismic shift in medieval power dynamics. Barely 2 months after her annulment from Louis VII, she stood before the altar with the 19-year-old Duke of Normandy, a match so audacious it left Europe reeling. On the surface, their alliance defied convention, a woman in her 30s wedding a man barely out of boyhood, but beneath the scandalized whispers lay a razor-sharp calculation. Henry wasn't just some minor lord. He was heir to Anjou, Normandy, and the English throne, a web of territories that, when woven together with Aquitaine, created an empire dwarfing France itself. The ceremony itself was a masterclass in political theatre. Eleanor chose the quiet cathedral of Poitiers over a grand Parisian spectacle, signaling her break from the past while anchoring her future in Aquitaine soil. No papal banners, no French dignitaries, just the hum of Occitan dialects and the quiet assurance of vassals who'd followed her family for generations. Yet the simplicity was deceptive. By marrying without Louis's permission technically required for a former queen, Eleanor and Henry flipped the script, forcing Europe to recognize their partnership as a fait accompli. Chroniclers gasped at the speed, but for Eleanor, haste was the point. Every day unmarried left her vulnerable to abduction or coercion. This wasn't romance, it was a chess move played at lightning speed. What followed was a geopolitical earthquake. Overnight, Henry controlled lands stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, a swath of territory later dubbed the Angevin Empire. For Louis, the implications were horrifying. His ex-wife's new husband now ruled more of France than he did, encircling the French crown like a vise. The marriage also reset Eleanor's reproductive clock. With Henry, she'd bear 5 sons, 3 of whom became kings, and 3 daughters, crafting a dynasty that would shape Europe for centuries. But perhaps her boldest power play was insisting Aquitaine remain hers alone, not Henry's. While medieval wives typically surrendered their lands, Eleanor's duchy stayed firmly under her control, a clause that would later fuel both her triumphs and her tragedies. Yet the most fascinating layer lies in the personal dynamics. Henry was everything Louis wasn't: charismatic, restless, and hungry for power. Their shared ambition became both glue and grenade, binding them in mutual pursuit of dominance while planting seeds of future conflict. Eleanor, now fluent in the art of royal marriage, knew better than to play the docile consort. She ruled Aquitaine in her own right, patronized troubadours who celebrated female agency, and advised Henry on everything from tax reforms to military campaigns. For a time, they were the ultimate power couple until the same qualities that drew them together would tear them apart. But in that sunlit moment of 1152, as their vows echoed through Poitiers' nave, Eleanor wasn't just remarrying. She was rewriting the rules of the game. Eleanor of Aquitaine arrived in England not just as a queen consort, but as a political force in her own right. While Henry II focused on consolidating his empire through sheer will and military might, Eleanor wielded power through shrewd diplomacy, cultural influence, and the sheer force of her lineage. Their court became a dazzling collision of Aquitanian sophistication and Angevin pragmatism, where troubadours sang of courtly love in one hall, while scribes drafted tax reforms in another. For nearly 2 decades, Eleanor served as Henry's most trusted regent, governing England during his frequent absences with a deft hand that earned her both admiration and quiet resentment from the barons. Her greatest leverage lay in the children she bore: 5 sons who would shape the destiny of Europe. Richard, the fiery future Lionheart, inherited her love of poetry and war. Geoffrey became a master of political intrigue, and John, the youngest, would one day sign the Magna Carta. But Eleanor's influence extended far beyond childbirth. She cultivated a court that celebrated intellect and artistry, transforming it into a magnet for scholars, musicians, and thinkers. Unlike Henry, who saw culture as a tool of control, Eleanor genuinely reveled in it, commissioning illuminated manuscripts, hosting debates on law and philosophy, and ensuring her daughters received the same education as her sons. Yet as Henry's reign progressed, shadows crept into their partnership. His relentless expansion, pushing into Ireland, Wales, and Brittany, stretched their resources thin, while his infamous temper grew unchecked. Worse, his paranoia festered, particularly toward their eldest sons. Convinced Eleanor was grooming Richard to usurp him, Henry began sidelining her, replacing her Aquitanian advisors with his own loyalists. The breaking point came when he demanded their sons swear fealty directly to him, bypassing Eleanor's authority in her ancestral lands. For a woman who'd spent decades balancing autonomy and alliance, this was an unforgivable betrayal. The court that once buzzed with creativity now thrummed with tension. Henry's spies whispered that Eleanor's troubadours were spreading sedition through their songs, while she watched helplessly as he dismantled the network she'd built. Their marriage, once a grand political alliance, curdled into a cold war of attrition, and when Henry imprisoned Rosamund Clifford, his most infamous mistress, in a tower at Woodstock, allegedly connected to Eleanor's quarters by a secret passage, the symbolism was grotesquely clear. Even love had become a weapon in their power struggle. Eleanor's next move would be her boldest yet, but it would come at a price even she couldn't foresee. The legend of Eleanor of Aquitaine's Court of Love reads like something from a troubadour's wildest fantasy, a place where knights and ladies gathered to debate matters of the heart, presided over by a queen who wielded the power to judge their romantic entanglements. According to medieval chroniclers, Eleanor and her daughter Marie transformed Poitiers into a glittering salon where love was codified like law, with rules dictating everything from how often lovers should meet to whether a peasant could love a noble. It's a tantalizing image, a 12th century feminist utopia where women held emotional sovereignty, but how much of this was real and how much was carefully crafted myth? The truth lies somewhere between propaganda and quiet rebellion. Records from Eleanor's time mention no formal court of love, no decrees, no official judgments. The most detailed accounts come from Andreas Capellanus, a cleric who wrote The Art of Courtly Love decades later, likely embellishing rumors into a literary sensation. Yet where there's smoke, there's often fire. Eleanor did turn Poitiers into a cultural hub after separating from Henry, surrounding herself with poets like Bernard de Ventador, whose lyrics celebrated women as arbiters of desire. Her granddaughter would later sponsor Chrétien de Troyes, whose Arthurian romances wove these ideals into legend. What makes the myth so enduring is its subversive core. In an era when the church preached that women were either virgins or temptresses, Eleanor's circle elevated romance to an intellectual pursuit. Troubadours sang of finima refined love that demanded fidelity and adoration from knights toward their ladies, flipping the script on traditional power dynamics. Whether Eleanor literally judged love cases or not, her patronage created a space where these ideas flourished, giving noblewomen a language to assert influence in a world that denied them legal authority. The Court of Love may not have been a physical tribunal, but as a cultural rebellion, it was revolutionary. By championing stories where women dictated the terms of devotion, Eleanor weaponized art to challenge the very foundations of medieval patriarchy, not with swords but with songs. And in doing so, she ensured her legacy would be whispered in ballads long after her enemies turned to dust. Eleanor of Aquitaine's rebellion against Henry II wasn't just a marital spat, it was a full-scale war that reshaped the fate of Europe. By the spring of 1173, tensions between the royal couple had reached a boiling point. Henry, notorious for his infidelities and iron-fisted rule, had systematically stripped Eleanor of power, replacing her trusted advisors with his own men and even undermining her authority in Aquitaine, the land she'd brought to their marriage. But Eleanor wasn't the type to fade quietly into the background. When her three eldest sons, young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rose in revolt against their father, she didn't just support them, she became the architect of their defiance. The reasons behind her gamble were as personal as they were political. Some chroniclers point to Henry's very public affair with Rosamund Clifford, the legendary Fair Rosamund, whose presence at court was a constant humiliation. Others argue it was Henry's refusal to grant their sons real power, keeping them as figureheads while he micromanaged every corner of their would-be kingdoms. But the truth ran deeper. Eleanor had spent decades navigating the brutal chessboard of medieval politics, and she recognized a grim reality. Henry's grip was suffocating their sons' futures and, by extension, her own legacy. So she made her move, rallying Aquitaine's lords to Richard's banner and sending covert messages to allies across France. The rebellion itself was a masterclass in medieval warfare, swift, chaotic, and devastating. Young Henry struck first, fleeing to the French court and declaring himself king with Louis VII's backing. Richard and Geoffrey followed, seizing key castles in Aquitaine and Brittany. For a few breathless months, it seemed the Angevin Empire might crumble under the weight of Henry's own family, but the king was a battlefield tactician without equal. He crushed the revolt with brutal efficiency, bribing some rebels, besieging others, and outmaneuvering his sons at every turn. By summer 1174, the uprising had collapsed and Eleanor's fate was sealed. Captured while disguised as a man trying to reach Paris, she was hauled before Henry like a common traitor. What followed was a captivity so prolonged it defied medieval norms. While rebellious noblemen typically earned pardons or quick executions, Eleanor was imprisoned for 16 years, shuttled between grim fortresses like Salisbury and Old Sarum, where damp walls and iron bars became her world. Officially, Henry called it protective custody, a way to shield her from the chaos she'd helped unleash. In reality, it was a calculated annihilation of her influence. No courtly salons, no political alliances, no access to her beloved Aquitaine, just silence and stone. Yet even in confinement, Eleanor's legend grew. Rumors swirled that she'd secretly corresponded with rebels through troubadour songs, or that Henry visited her cell to beg advice during crises. Poets spun tales of her defiance, imagining her pacing her quarters like a caged lioness plotting her next move. And in a way, they were right. Though her body was confined, her mind never stopped working. She knew history's pendulum always swung, and when Henry finally died in 1189, it was Eleanor who emerged from the shadows, not as a broken prisoner, but as the architect of a new era. Her sons would need her, and this time she'd make sure they listened. The moment Henry II drew his last breath in 1189, Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just step out of the shadows, she strode back onto the stage of history with the vigor of a woman half her age. After 16 years of imprisonment, most would have retreated into quiet retirement. Not Eleanor. With Richard now king, she became the beating heart of the Angevin Empire, governing England with a steady hand while her beloved Lionheart embarked on the Third Crusade. This wasn't mere maternal duty, it was the culmination of a lifetime's political mastery. At 70 years old, an age when medieval nobles were expected to fade into pious obscurity, Eleanor ruled as regent with the same sharp wit and strategic brilliance that had defined her youth. Richard's departure left a gaping power vacuum, and Eleanor filled it with astonishing efficiency. She toured the realm, settling disputes between barons, confirming charters, and even overhauling corrupt sheriffs, proving her son's trust wasn't misplaced. But her true test came in 1192, when news arrived that Richard had been captured by Duke Leopold of Austria on his return from the Holy Land. The ransom demanded was staggering, 150,000 marks, nearly 3 times England's annual revenue. Lesser rulers might have panicked. Eleanor saw an opportunity. What followed was a financial and diplomatic blitz that showcased her unparalleled network. She levied a 25% tax on noble incomes, confiscated church silver, and even emptied royal coffers down to the last penny. But her genius lay in the details. Knowing mere money wouldn't guarantee Richard's safety, she personally negotiated with the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, securing terms that allowed installments while preventing rival factions from exploiting the crisis. Then, in a move that left chroniclers breathless, this septuagenarian queen embarked on a winter trek across the Alps to deliver the first payment herself, braving snow-choked passes and bandit-infested roads that would have daunted knights half her age. Her travels didn't stop there. To stabilize the realm, she crisscrossed Europe like a woman possessed, mediating conflicts in Aquitaine, arranging strategic marriages for Richard's nieces, and even outmaneuvering Philip Augustus of France, who saw Richard's captivity as a chance to dismantle the Angevin Empire. Through it all, she wielded soft power with the precision of a surgeon, her letters to popes and princes blending flattery, threats, and razor-sharp logic. When Richard finally returned in 1194, England wasn't just intact, it was fortified, its alliances reshaped by his mother's tireless diplomacy. Yet the most poignant detail lies in the quiet symbolism of those years. While Richard fought under the banner of the Lionheart, it was Eleanor who ensured there was still a kingdom to come home to. Her regency wasn't just about keeping the throne warm, it was a masterclass in how to wield authority without a crown, proving that even in an age of swords, the sharpest weapon was often a woman's wit. And as Richard rode through London's cheering crowds, his first act was to publicly kneel before the woman who'd moved mountains to bring him home, not just a queen, but the architect of his survival. When Richard the Lionheart died unexpectedly in 1199, struck down by a crossbow bolt during a petty siege in Limousin, Eleanor of Aquitaine faced a crisis that would test her political genius like never before. At 77, she might have been expected to retreat from the chaos, but instead, she became the last pillar holding up the crumbling Angevin Empire. Her youngest son, John, now inherited the crown, and from the moment he took the throne, the realm teetered on the edge of disaster. Where Richard had been a warrior king, John proved erratic, paranoid, and woefully outmatched by Philip Augustus of France, who smelled blood in the water. Eleanor's first move was pure strategy. She secured Aquitaine. While John bumbled through diplomatic blunders, she rode south to Poitiers, rallying her vassals with the sheer force of her presence. This wasn't just nostalgia for her ancestral lands. It was a desperate bid to anchor the empire's southern flank. She knew Philip would exploit any weakness, and Aquitaine, with its rebellious nobles and shifting loyalties, was the linchpin. With a mix of charm and steel, she reaffirmed oaths, smoothed grievances, and even negotiated a truce with neighboring Toulouse, buying John time he didn't deserve. Meanwhile, John's reign spiraled. His disastrous marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, already betrothed to another lord, sparked a rebellion in Aquitaine, giving Philip the perfect pretext to invade. While John dithered, Eleanor took action. At 80, she crossed the Pyrenees into Castile to fetch her granddaughter Blanche, orchestrating a brilliant marriage alliance between Blanche and Philip's son Louis. The message was clear. Even as John lost ground, Eleanor could still play the long game, binding France's future to her own bloodline. But her greatest act of defiance came in 1202 when Philip's forces overran Normandy. While John fled to England, Eleanor personally held Poitiers against a French siege, her name alone keeping the gates from collapsing. It was a final, breathtaking display of her lifelong rule. Loyalty didn't come from fear, but from reverence. When she finally surrendered, negotiating terms that spared the city, it marked the end of an era. The Angevin Empire was fracturing, but even in defeat, Eleanor dictated the terms of its unraveling. Her death in 1204, just months after retiring to Fontevraud Abbey, felt like the last candle snuffing out. John's disastrous reign would culminate in Magna Carta, but the true tragedy lay in what he squandered, the legacy of a woman who'd spent 8 decades outthinking kings. In the end, Eleanor's brilliance couldn't compensate for John's failures, but her final years proved that even as empires fell, her political mastery never dimmed. At the heart of Eleanor of Aquitaine's volatile marriage to Henry II lies one of history's most enduring legends, the tale of Rosamund Clifford, the young noblewoman whose beauty supposedly captivated the king and shattered the queen's pride. Known as Fair Rosamund, her story is woven with equal parts fact and folklore, a tantalizing mix of palace whispers and medieval melodrama. The most infamous version claims Henry built her a secret bower at Woodstock, complete with a labyrinth to shield her from Eleanor's wrath, only for the vengeful queen to discover the path using a thread, then offer Rosamund a poisoned chalice or dagger. It's a scene straight from a troubadour's tragic ballad, but how much of it reflects reality? The truth about Rosamund is far murkier than legend suggests. Contemporary chronicles mention her only briefly, noting she was the daughter of a Welsh marcher lord and became Henry's mistress around 1174 precisely, when Eleanor was imprisoned for supporting their son's revolt. This timing is crucial. With Eleanor confined, Henry had little need for labyrinths or secrecy. Rosamund lived openly at court, even bearing him 2 sons. The elaborate myth of hidden gardens and deadly rivalries likely bloomed decades later, as monastic writers hostile to Eleanor's power spun her into a scheming villainess. But what did Eleanor actually think of Rosamund? Here, history falls silent. No record suggests she ever confronted the young woman, and the timing of Rosamund's death hints at a quieter truth. She retired to Godstow Abbey around 1176, possibly ill or pregnant, and died shortly after. When Henry donated to the abbey for her tomb, the nuns honored her as Rose of the World, a pious benefactor, not a seductress. Eleanor, still imprisoned, would have had no means or motive to harm her. The poisoning tale only surfaced centuries later, a convenient way to paint Eleanor as the jealous queen and Rosamund as the innocent martyr. The deeper question isn't about poison, it's about power. Eleanor's rage wasn't directed at Rosamund but at Henry. His affairs were hardly discreet. One chronicler cheekily noted the king plucked the flowers of many noble daughters. Yet Rosamund became the scapegoat for a far greater betrayal, Henry's systematic dismantling of Eleanor's authority. The labyrinth myth endures because it reduces their clash to a love triangle, when in reality it was a battle over dynastic control. Eleanor cared less about Henry's dalliances than his theft of Aquitaine from her sons, and by extension from her. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in Eleanor's later actions. As regent for Richard, she visited Godstow Abbey herself, where Rosamund's tomb still stood. Did she pause before it, curse it, or recognize a kindred spirit, another woman whose life was twisted into legend by the ambitions of kings? The mystery of Rosamund Clifford isn't just about a mistress and a queen. It's about how history distills women's lives into morality tales, erasing their complexity to serve someone else's narrative. Eleanor knew that better than anyone. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just rule lands, she shaped imaginations. At her courts in Poitiers and elsewhere, she cultivated a cultural renaissance that would echo through centuries, turning the raw material of legend into political propaganda and personal legacy. The Arthurian romances we know today, tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, of chivalry and forbidden love, weren't merely entertainment in her hands. They were subtle tools of power, reinforcing ideals that mirrored her own life. A world where women could command loyalty, where love and politics intertwined, and where the Occitan values of her youth found fertile ground in Norman and English soil. Her patronage of troubadours was revolutionary. These wandering poets singing in the Occitan tongue of Finema refined, almost spiritual devotion to a lady elevated Eleanor's court into something far more dangerous than a gathering of nobles. It became a school of thought. Bernard de Ventador, her most famous protégé, wove verses that blurred the line between romantic adoration and feudal service, implying that a knight's loyalty to his lady could rival his oath to a king. In a society where marriages were cold transactions, these ideas were radical, even subversive, and Eleanor, ever the strategist, knew their worth. By sponsoring troubadours, she wasn't just celebrating art, she was reframing the narrative around women's agency, one song at a time. Then came the Arthurian explosion. While Eleanor didn't invent these legends, her court became the crucible where they transformed from obscure Welsh folklore into Europe's defining mythos. Chrétien de Troyes, writing under her daughter Marie's patronage, penned Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, a story where Queen Guinevere, not King Arthur, holds the moral and emotional authority. The parallels to Eleanor's life are unmistakable. A queen entangled in scandal yet radiating power, a kingdom where the ruler's spouse could eclipse the throne itself. Even the famous Round Table, symbolizing equality among knights, mirrored Eleanor's own salon culture, where debates flowed freely across social ranks. But her cultural influence didn't stop at literature. Through her granddaughter Blanche of Castile, future Queen Regent of France, Eleanor's Occitan sensibilities infiltrated the heart of her former enemy's court. Blanche, raised on troubadour poetry and Arthurian ideals, would later champion similar themes in Paris, softening the rigid French monarchy with echoes of Aquitaine sophistication. In this way, Eleanor's legacy outlasted kingdoms. While Henry's Angevin empire crumbled, her cultural fingerprints endured, reshaping medieval Europe's art, gender norms, and even its dreams. The brilliance of her patronage lay in its duality. On the surface, it was mere courtly diversion, songs to pass the evening, stories to entertain. But beneath the glitter, Eleanor was rewriting the rules, proving that whoever controls the stories controls the future. Long after her death, minstrels still sang of Guinevere's grace and Lancelot's devotion, never quite admitting that the most compelling Arthurian figure wasn't fictional at all. She'd been there all along, a queen who turned myth into a mirror, showing the world what power could look like when wielded by a woman unafraid to redefine her own legend. Eleanor of Aquitaine's final act was as deliberate as her first. In the winter of 1200, at nearly 80 years old, she withdrew from the turbulent world she'd spent a lifetime shaping and entered the quiet cloisters of Fontevraud Abbey. This wasn't just a retreat, it was a strategic choice. Fontevraud wasn't any monastery. It was a dual community of monks and nuns, famed for its independence and ruled by abbesses who answered directly to the Pope. Here, in this sanctuary of powerful women, Eleanor could remain close to the political currents while ostensibly renouncing them. She spent her last years in a modest dwelling near the Abbey church, its walls likely lined with books rather than the tapestries of her youth, her days punctuated by prayer, correspondence, and the occasional visit from Richard's successor, King John. Her death on April 1, 1204, marked the end of an era, but her tomb at Fontevraud ensured she'd never fade from memory. The effigy that survives today is a masterpiece of medieval art, Eleanor carved in cold limestone, lying regally beside Henry II and their son Richard the Lionheart. Unlike traditional funerary sculptures which depicted the dead as stiff and solemn, Eleanor's effigy shows her awake, her eyes open, a book in her hands. It's a stunning detail. Even in death, she's alert, engaged, forever reading the world she once ruled. The sculptor captured her fine cheekbones, the drape of her gown, even the folds of her wimple with startling realism, as if to defy time itself. Yet for all its grandeur, Eleanor's tomb raises tantalizing questions. During the French Revolution, when mobs ransacked monasteries and smashed royal graves, Fontevraud's necropolis escaped wholesale destruction. Some say the abbey's remote location spared it. Others whisper that revolutionary soldiers, recognizing Eleanor's name from ballads and legends, hesitated to desecrate a woman who defied kings. But the real mystery lies in what's missing. Contemporary accounts mention jewels adorning her effigy, perhaps a crown or the rings she wore as queen. Were they looted centuries earlier, hidden by sympathetic monks, or did Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, ensure they were melted down to fund Richard's ransom long before her death? Even her remains tell a story of disappearance. During restoration work in the 19th century, workers discovered bones beneath the effigies, but forensic analysis confirmed they were mixed together, as if the tombs had been disturbed and rearranged. Were Eleanor's relics moved secretly during the Revolution, or had they been scattered long before, leaving only her stone likeness to guard her legacy? Today, visitors to Fontevraud still leave flowers at the foot of her effigy, as if paying tribute to a queen who refuses to be forgotten. The tomb may be empty, but the woman it represents still looms larger than life, a ruler who mastered the art of making myth as deftly as she wielded power. The chroniclers who documented Eleanor of Aquitaine's life couldn't seem to agree on whether she was a demon or a diplomat. Gerald of Wales, a cleric with a penchant for scandal, painted her as a venomous seductress, a queen who ensnared men's hearts with witchcraft and stirred her sons to rebellion out of spite. Yet other chroniclers, like Richard of Devizes, praised her statesmanship during Richard's reign, calling her the eagle of the broken alliance who reunited the wings of the realm. This stark divide in her historical portrayal reveals less about Eleanor herself and more about the anxieties of medieval men grappling with a woman who refused to be small. What makes these accounts so contentious is how they reflect the era's deep-seated misogyny. Eleanor's power, whether as a divorced queen, a rebellious wife, or a regent ruling in her son's name, threatened the very foundations of medieval patriarchy. When she rode to Jerusalem with bare-breasted Amazons, a likely fabrication, it wasn't just gossip, it was a cautionary tale about women stepping beyond their God-given roles. Even her patronage of courtly love poetry was twisted into something sinister, with monks accusing her of promoting adultery as policy. The truth, she was navigating a world where a woman's influence had to be framed as either divine virtue or sinful manipulation, never just competence. Modern historians have peeled back these layers of propaganda to reveal a far more nuanced figure. Scholars like Alison Weir and Amy Kelly argue that Eleanor's schemes were often pragmatic moves to protect her children's inheritance, actions that, had they been undertaken by a king, would have been praised as shrewd statecraft. Her infamous rebellion against Henry, a calculated effort to secure Aquitaine for Richard, not a tantrum over Rosamund Clifford. Even her imprisonment, long cast as romantic martyrdom, was likely a cold-blooded power play by Henry to neutralize a political rival. The most telling revision lies in her later years. Far from fading into irrelevance, Eleanor's regency for Richard showcased her mastery of soft power, diplomacy, patronage, and dynastic strategy. Where chroniclers once saw a temptress, we now recognize a CEO-style ruler who leveraged culture, marriage alliances, and economic reforms to stabilize a fracturing empire. Her reputation didn't need rehabilitating, it needed reframing, stripping away the moralizing to reveal what was always there, a woman who understood power's price and paid it without flinching. Perhaps the greatest irony is how Eleanor weaponized the very stereotypes used against her. By allowing troubadours to mythologize her as a romantic heroine, she carved out space for generations of noblewomen to wield influence under the guise of inspiration. The chroniclers who vilified her unwittingly cemented her immortality, ensuring that even their slanders became proof of her extraordinary reach. In the end, history's polarized portraits don't obscure Eleanor, they illuminate the fear she provoked. To be called both witch and queen wasn't contradiction. It was the only vocabulary medieval writers had for a woman who defied every box they built. The fate of Aquitaine after Eleanor's death is one of history's great geopolitical riddles. Despite her lifelong struggle to keep the duchy bound to the English crown, even rebelling against Henry II to secure it for Richard, the land ultimately slipped back into French hands within a generation. On the surface, it seems like a baffling reversal, a betrayal of everything Eleanor fought for. But the truth lies in the tangled web of medieval inheritance law, dynastic ambition, and a single overlooked clause that would undo her life's work. Eleanor's greatest miscalculation may have been treating Aquitaine as her personal property rather than a chess piece in a larger game. As Duchess, she retained sovereignty over the land, a rare privilege for a medieval woman. But when she assigned it to Richard the Lionheart, she assumed his heirs would inherit it. Instead, Richard died childless, leaving the duchy to his brother John, a king so inept he earned the nickname Soft Sword. John's disastrous reign saw him lose Normandy and most of Angevin France to Philip Augustus, leaving Aquitaine as England's last continental foothold. Here's where the legal trap snapped shut. Eleanor's marriage contract with Henry explicitly stated Aquitaine would remain separate from the English crown, a condition meant to preserve her autonomy. But that very clause gave Philip a legal opening. When John refused to appear in a Parisian court to settle a dispute with one of his vassals, Philip invoked feudal law, declaring John had forfeited Aquitaine by failing his duty as a vassal of France. It was a masterstroke of legal warfare, exploiting the same loophole Eleanor had once used to her advantage. The final blow came from Eleanor's own descendants. Her granddaughter Blanche, married to Philip's son Louis VIII, became Queen of France, and instead of defending Aquitaine's independence, she worked to absorb it into the French crown. By the time Eleanor's great-grandson Henry III tried to reclaim the duchy, Aquitaine's nobles had grown weary of absentee English rulers and switched allegiances. The land that had defined Eleanor's life became a bargaining chip in treaties, shrinking to a sliver of its former glory until even that was lost in the 100 Years' War. What makes this reversal so poignant is how it mirrors Eleanor's own story. Just as she outmaneuvered kings to preserve her power, her successors were outplayed by the very system she'd mastered. Aquitaine's fate wasn't a failure of her strategy. It was proof of how fragile even the grandest designs could be in the face of shifting loyalties and the relentless march of time. The duchy slipped away not because Eleanor didn't fight hard enough, but because no single life, no matter how extraordinary, could control the tides of history forever. History has a way of silencing inconvenient voices, but Eleanor of Aquitaine refused to be erased, even from behind castle walls. During those 16 long years of imprisonment, while Henry II thought he'd buried her influence in damp stone, whispers persist of a secret network humming beneath the surface. Official records from this period are suspiciously sparse, as if someone meticulously scrubbed the parchment clean. Yet between the gaps, a missing date here, an abrupt shift in policy, there clues emerge of a queen still pulling strings. Take the sudden reconciliation between Henry and their son Richard in 1183, after years of bitter estrangement. Chroniclers chalk it up to royal mercy, but the timing raises eyebrows. Just months earlier, Eleanor had been briefly transferred to Winchester Castle, coincidentally, a stronghold loyal to her ally, the Bishop of Rouen. No letters survived to prove it, but the bishop's own accounts mention unexpected counsel that softened Henry's stance. Could Eleanor have smuggled out messages hidden in prayer books or sewn into the linens of visiting clergy? Monastic scribes of the era knew dozens of cipher techniques, from simple letter substitutions to wax tablets scraped away to reveal hidden ink beneath. Then there's the peculiar case of Bertrand de Born, the troubadour whose songs praising Richard's rebellion were banned in Henry's court yet kept circulating in Aquitaine. One verse in particular stands out: "The eagle in her cage still sings, and her song flies farther than arrows." Poetic fancy, perhaps, but de Born was no stranger to coded language. His family held lands along Eleanor's old pilgrimage routes, where loyalists could have carried word under the guise of penitent travel. Most tantalizing is the silence surrounding Eleanor's jailers. Henry rotated her guards frequently, a move historians attribute to paranoia. Yet payroll records show several were Aquitanian knights from families sworn to her since girlhood, men whose loyalties might have bent toward discretion. One guard, Pierre de Blois, later wrote of delivering comforts to the Queen, including parchment and quills for devotional writing. That such materials were permitted at all hints at concessions Henry couldn't openly explain. The greatest evidence of Eleanor's covert diplomacy lies in what happened the moment Henry died. Within days of his passing, she emerged not as a broken captive but as a sovereign issuing orders, freeing prisoners, securing treasuries, and dispatching envoys to Rome. These weren't the actions of someone cut off from the world. They were the moves of a player who'd kept her hands on the board all along. The ink may have faded from her secret letters, but their legacy endures in the quiet spaces between the official record, where a queen's defiance outwitted even history's censors. Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters lived in the shadow of their lion-hearted brothers, their stories often reduced to footnotes in the grand saga of the Angevin dynasty. Matilda, Eleanor, and Joanna each bore the weight of their mother's legacy while navigating a world that prized sons over daughters. Yet their lives were no less dramatic, filled with political gambles, personal tragedies, and quiet acts of defiance that shaped the fate of kingdoms. Take Matilda, the eldest, married off at 12 to Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, a match meant to secure an alliance against the Holy Roman Emperor. While chroniclers focused on Richard's crusades, Matilda was ruling alongside her husband, patronizing scholars, and mediating conflicts in a turbulent German court. When Henry was exiled, she didn't retreat to a nunnery as expected. Instead, she followed him to England, where her brother Richard granted them refuge and later orchestrated her children's marriages to shore up their fortunes. Her daughter would become the mother of Otto IV, the only Holy Roman Emperor descended from English royalty, a lineage traced straight back to Eleanor's bloodline. Then there was Eleanor, namesake of her formidable mother. Married to Alfonso VIII of Castile, she became a queen consort whose influence rippled far beyond the ceremonial. In a court where Moorish and Christian cultures clashed, she championed troubadour traditions, importing her mother's Occitan sensibilities to Iberia. But her true legacy was in the nursery. She bore 11 children, including Blanche of Castile, the future queen regent of France. Blanche, raised on stories of her grandmother's court, would later outmaneuver barons and invaders with the same steel-willed diplomacy Eleanor of Aquitaine had mastered. The quiet irony: while Eleanor's sons lost Angevin lands, her granddaughter Blanche helped cement French dominance, a twist even the Queen might have appreciated. Joanna's story, though, is the most heartbreaking. Married at 11 to William II of Sicily, she navigated a glittering but treacherous court where Norman, Arab, and Greek factions vied for power. When William died suddenly, leaving her a teenage widow, the Sicilian barons turned on her, refusing to recognize her dowry rights. Richard the Lionheart, en route to the Third Crusade, stormed into Messina to reclaim her treasures. Legend says he seized a golden table meant for the emperor himself. But Joanna's resilience shone brightest later when she married Raymond VI of Toulouse, her mother's longtime rival. Their union briefly pacified Aquitaine's volatile borders, proving Joanna wasn't just a pawn but a peacemaker. Her final act, joining her mother on a grueling trek across the Pyrenees to fetch Blanche for marriage, ended in tragedy. Exhausted and ill, she sought refuge at Fontevraud Abbey, where she died, her body laid to rest in the very cloisters Eleanor would soon inhabit. Why did history forget these women? Partly because medieval chroniclers prioritized kings and conquests, but also because Eleanor's own legend eclipsed them. Her daughters were threads in a grander tapestry, their lives woven into the fabric of empires rather than emblazoned on banners. Yet their influence endured through Blanche's rule in France, through Matilda's imperial descendants, through Joanna's doomed but daring diplomacy. They weren't just Eleanor's daughters, they were her quiet heirs, proving that power could be wielded just as effectively from the shadows as from the throne. Deep in the forests of Limousin, an encounter unfolded that would later haunt Eleanor of Aquitaine's legend. A nameless hermit, sometimes called Peter of Pontibus in whispered accounts, emerged from the shadows as Richard the Lionheart passed through the region en route to besiege Chalice Castle in the spring of 1199. The holy man, gaunt from years of ascetic living, allegedly grasped the king's bridle with skeletal fingers and delivered a warning that chilled even the battle-hardened monarch. Turn back, or you will meet your death where the eagle weeps. Richard, ever dismissive of superstition, laughed and rode on straight toward the crumbling walls of Chalice, where a stray crossbow bolt would soon find his shoulder, festering into a fatal wound over 11 agonizing days. The prophecy's eerie timing raises eyebrows. Medieval chroniclers loved portentous omens, especially when they could frame a king's death as divine retribution. Gerald of Wales, never one to miss dramatic flair, wrote years after the fact that Eleanor had dreamed of a shattered crown the night before Richard's injury, a detail suspiciously absent from earlier accounts. Even the hermit's alleged reference to the eagle weeping feels too perfectly symbolic, slotting neatly into Eleanor's lifelong iconography as the eagle of the broken alliance. Could this entire prophecy be a later fabrication, stitched together by monks who needed Richard's shocking death to carry moral weight? But peel back the layers and a grain of truth emerges. Limousin was a hotbed of hermits and mystics in the 12th century, many living in caves along the pilgrim routes to Rocamadour. These ascetics often delivered blunt warnings to nobles, believing themselves mouthpieces for divine justice. What's more, Richard's siege of Chalice, a minor castle held by just a handful of knights, was so militarily insignificant that contemporaries struggled to explain why he'd risk his life there. A cryptic prophecy would at least provide narrative sense to a senseless death. Eleanor's reaction lends the tale haunting credibility. When news of Richard's injury reached her at Fontevraud, she reportedly set out immediately, covering 200 miles in breakneck time despite her 77 years. By the time she arrived, her son was already slipping away. Witnesses described her kneeling at his bedside, dry-eyed and stern, as if she'd long braced for this blow. Whether she recalled the hermit's words in that moment remains unknown. But the image of the eagle mourning her cub became indelible. The most compelling evidence against the prophecy's authenticity lies in its convenient moralizing. By the 13th century, Richard's death was being framed as punishment for his sins, his defiance of Henry II, his sack of monasteries during the Crusades. The hermit's warning fit too neatly into this didactic arc. Yet even if the encounter never happened, its persistence in folklore reveals something profound. Medieval minds needed Eleanor's grief to feel predestined, a tragedy written in the stars rather than a random twist of fate. The Chalice prophecy, whether fact or fiction, became the emotional keystone of her story. The moment the indomitable queen finally met a loss even she couldn't outmaneuver. Perhaps the truth isn't in the prophecy's accuracy, but in why storytellers clung to it. For a woman who defied every convention, this sliver of foreshadowing softened her edges, making her superhuman resilience suddenly achingly human. The hermit's words real or imagined gave shape to the unthinkable, that Eleanor of Aquitaine, after 8 decades of bending history to her will, could be broken by something as simple as a mother's love. When Eleanor of Aquitaine faced the impossible task of raising Richard the Lionheart's ransom 150,000 marks, a sum so vast it dwarfed England's annual income, she didn't just scrape together coins. She engineered an economic revolution. Medieval queens weren't expected to understand finance, let alone innovate it. Yet Eleanor transformed taxation from a blunt instrument of tyranny into a precise tool of statecraft, proving her mastery extended far beyond courtly intrigue. Her first move was radical transparency. Instead of brute force demands, she convened a council of barons and bishops, laying bare the crisis: pay now or lose their king to the Holy Roman Emperor forever. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was psychological leverage. By framing the ransom as collective salvation, she turned resistance into treason. Then came her masterstroke, the Saladin tithe, a 25% levy on movable property and income, exempting only the armor and horses knights needed for war. The name was genius propaganda, evoking the crusading enemy to make extortion feel patriotic. But Eleanor knew taxes alone wouldn't suffice. She unleashed a 3-pronged assault on England's wealth. First, she emptied the royal treasury down to the last silver spoon, melting crowns and confiscating church plate, a move that terrified clerics but showcased her willingness to sacrifice symbols for survival. Next, she strong-armed monasteries into voluntary contributions, leveraging her ties to Fontevraud Abbey to set a precedent others couldn't refuse. Finally, she revolutionized trade, negotiating accelerated customs duties with Flanders and Aquitaine's wine merchants, effectively taking out loans against future commerce. The most overlooked tactic, her manipulation of feudal obligations. Instead of demanding cash from nobles, she allowed them to pay in kind grain, wool, even ships, which her agents then sold at premium prices to Flemish weavers and Italian bankers. This flexibility prevented liquidity crises in regions where coin was scarce, demonstrating her grasp of local economies. Meanwhile, she issued standardized receipts to donors, creating an early form of government bonds that could be traded or redeemed later, a financial innovation centuries ahead of its time. What made Eleanor's system extraordinary wasn't just its scale, but its fairness. Chroniclers noted with surprise that peasants weren't crushed under the weight of the levy. By taxing movable wealth rather than land, she shielded subsistence farmers while squeezing the hoarded riches of abbeys and merchant guilds. Even Jews, typically scapegoated in fiscal crises, were protected under her orders, not out of altruism, but because she recognized their networks as vital to international money transfers. The ransom's success wasn't inevitable. Lesser rulers might have resorted to pillage or punitive seizures, sparking rebellions. Eleanor's genius lay in making England believe this was their fight too. When she personally escorted the first installment across the Alps in winter, 65,000 marks packed in guarded wagons, it wasn't just money she carried. It was the credibility of a system built on participation, not coercion. By the time Richard was freed in 1194, Eleanor hadn't just saved a king. She'd rewritten the playbook on medieval finance, proving that even in an age of swords, the sharpest weapon was a well-balanced ledger. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just wear clothes, she wielded them. In a world where medieval queens were expected to fade into the background like pious shadows, her wardrobe was a manifesto in silk and gold, a calculated rebellion against the dull grays and muted blues of traditional queenship. Take the golden wimple, that iconic headdress framing her face in later portraits. More than mere modesty, it was a crown substitute, a way to project regality without overtly challenging her husband's authority. While other noblewomen covered their hair with simple linen, Eleanor's wimples shimmered with metallic threads, catching candlelight in throne rooms and abbey chapels alike, a silent reminder that even in widowhood, she remained a sovereign duchess, her status irrefutable as the glint of precious metal. Then there were the scarlet robes, a color so bold it bordered on heresy in 12th century Europe. Crimson dye, extracted from rare Mediterranean insects, cost more than its weight in silver, making it the ultimate power flex. But Eleanor's choice went deeper than wealth. Scarlet was the hue of emperors and cardinals, a shade traditionally forbidden to women. By draping herself in it, she blurred the lines between queen and king, consort and ruler. Chroniclers noted how she wore it during key moments, receiving vassals in Poitiers, riding into cities alongside Richard, each appearance a visual proclamation that she wasn't just advising power. She embodied it. Her jewelry too carried coded messages. While pious queens favored plain crosses, Eleanor's brooches featured leopards and eagles, the heraldic beasts of Aquitaine and the Plantagenets. These weren't decorations, they were territorial claims in enamel and gemstones. Even her belts told a story. Extravagantly long and tipped with gold, they mimicked the ceremonial swords carried by male rulers, a subtle nod to the authority she held in lands like Aquitaine, where duchesses ruled as sovereigns long before her time. The real masterstroke was how she adapted her style to each role. As young Queen of France, she embraced the flowing, uncorseted gowns of Occitania, scandalizing Parisian clerics who associated the silhouette with troubadours' sinful love songs. Later, as Henry's queen, she adopted the tighter Norman sleeves and fitted bodices favored by English nobility, but kept the Occitan flair in her embroidery, weaving vines and songbirds into the hems as a whisper of her roots. By the time she presided over the court of love, her garments became canvases for political allegory. Sleeves slit to reveal luxurious linings, a metaphor for the hidden depths of women's intellect. Cloaks lined with vair fur, a luxury reserved for royalty, declaring her equality with kings. This wasn't vanity, it was visual diplomacy. In an era when most people would never hear their monarch speak, clothing was a language everyone understood. Eleanor's brilliance lay in speaking it fluently, using every hem and clasp to remind the world that while men might hold titles, she controlled the symbols that made those titles legible. Even in her effigy at Fontevraud, the sculptor carved her not in the shroud-like garb of the devout dead, but in the rich folds of a queen's mantle, her hands clutching a book instead of prayer beads. A final, eternal declaration. Power wasn't just something she wore. It was something she read, wrote, and rewrote to her own design. Eleanor of Aquitaine's relationship with faith was as layered as her political maneuverings, a tapestry of genuine devotion and cold strategy stitched together by necessity. Take Fontevraud Abbey, the monastic order she championed in her later years. This wasn't just any religious house, it was a sanctuary where women held absolute authority, its abbesses ruling over monks and nuns alike under the protection of the Pope himself. Eleanor's patronage here was no accident. In an era when the Church dictated a woman's place, Fontevraud's very existence was revolutionary, a place where daughters of noble families could wield spiritual power that mirrored secular influence. Her donations weren't merely pious gestures, they were investments in an institution that defied the patriarchal order, offering refuge to widows like herself who refused to disappear into obscurity. Yet contrast this with the Eleanor of the Second Crusade, excommunicated by Pope Eugene III alongside her husband Louis for allegedly turning the Holy Campaign into a scandalous parade. Chroniclers painted her as a Jezebel on horseback, her lavish tents and troubadour entourage blasphemous against the austerity of pilgrimage. But was this really sacrilege, or a calculated defiance of the Church's attempts to sanitize her influence? Her insistence on traveling with royal splendor, on debating military strategy with her uncle Raymond in Antioch, wasn't just vanity. It was a declaration that a queen's role couldn't be reduced to silent prayer while men decided the fate of kingdoms. The tension between these two faces of Eleanor, the abbey's benefactor and the excommunicated queen, reveals a woman who understood religion as both sword and shield. When she retired to Fontevraud, it wasn't surrender, it was another kind of power play. The abbey's dual communities allowed her to maintain networks of influence under the guise of piety, her chambers becoming a salon for discreet diplomacy. Meanwhile, her tomb there, carved with an open book instead of clasped hands in prayer, whispers volumes. This was no traditional effigy of a penitent. It was the image of a ruler who engaged with scripture on her own terms, interpreting divine will as deftly as she navigated royal courts. Perhaps the key lies in Aquitaine's unique spiritual landscape. Raised in a land where the cult of Mary Magdalene flourished, a saint reinvented as a redeemed yet powerful woman, Eleanor would have seen faith as mutable, capable of bending to accommodate ambition. Her gifts to Fontevraud's relic collection included a supposed thorn from Christ's crown, a treasure that drew pilgrims and their wealth. Even in devotion, she curated symbols that elevated female agency, ensuring the abbey's prestige would outlast her. The contradiction fades when viewed through the lens of survival. Excommunication during the Crusade was a political weapon, one she weathered because she knew papal decrees could be reversed. Patronage of Fontevraud, though, was legacy building, a way to cement her place in a celestial court where queens, not just kings, held sway. Eleanor's piety wasn't a binary of devout or deceitful. It was the practiced art of using faith as another thread in the loom of power. And like all her weavings, the pattern was intricate, deliberate, and designed to endure. History left us Eleanor of Aquitaine's deeds, but stole her voice. Where are the diaries, the letters, the intimate musings of a queen who ruled for 7 decades? For a woman educated beyond most men of her time, fluent in Latin and Occitan, surrounded by poets and scholars, the absence of personal writings feels like a theft. The likeliest explanation is also the cruelest, deliberate destruction. Medieval chroniclers were monks, men trained to record events through the lens of male virtue and vice. A queen who divorced one king, rebelled against another, and ruled like a sovereign in her own right. Her unfiltered thoughts would have been dangerous, a challenge to the very order these scribes upheld. Consider what we know was lost. Eleanor maintained a lively correspondence. Her letters to Pope Celestine and Emperor Henry survive only because they were copied into official registers. Private notes, those would have been written on fragile parchment, easily burned by nervous heirs or prudish clerics. Henry II had motive to purge her papers during her imprisonment, scrubbing away evidence of her political networks. Later, during the French Revolution, Fontevraud's archives were ransacked, possibly taking any surviving cash with them. Yet tantalizing gaps in the record suggest some writings might still surface. In the Châteaux of the Loire Valley, archives stuffed with uncatalogued medieval documents occasionally yield surprises, like the discovery in 2019 of lost epistles by another formidable queen, Anne of Brittany. Could Eleanor's voice be hiding in a crumbling ledger or sewn into the binding of a prayer book? Perhaps the most intriguing theory involves the troubadours. Eleanor's court poet, Bernard de Ventador, wrote of exchanging verses with her. Could some lyrics attributed to him actually be her work? Medieval women often published under male pseudonyms. The lament, "I must sing, though it pains me," traditionally ascribed to Ventador, reads uncannily like a queen straining against captivity. The silence speaks volumes. What terrifies patriarchs more than a clever woman? One who writes down her cleverness. Eleanor's missing words may be her final rebellion, a void that forces us to listen harder to what history tried to erase. Hollywood has never quite known what to do with Eleanor of Aquitaine, too powerful to ignore, too complex to capture. The most famous portrayal, Katharine Hepburn's Oscar-winning Turn in the Lion in Winter, gives us a queen of razor wit and regal fury, trading barbs with Peter O'Toole's Henry II in a Christmas court that feels more like a boxing match. It's magnificent theatre, but history takes a backseat to drama. The real Eleanor was imprisoned at Salisbury during the 1183 succession crisis depicted in the film, not scheming openly with her sons. Yet Hepburn's performance taps into an essential truth. Eleanor's mind was her sharpest weapon, and her love for her children as fierce as her political calculus. Novels often stumble into the opposite trap, flattening her into a romantic heroine or one-dimensional villain. Sharon K. Penman's Time and Chance paints a vivid portrait of Eleanor's marriage to Henry, capturing the intoxicating rush of their early alliance and the slow poison of betrayal. But even Penman succumbs to the Rosamund Clifford myth, framing Eleanor's rage as jealousy rather than the territorial fury of a woman watching her son's inheritance gambled away. Meanwhile, modern retellings like the Book of Eleanor reduce her to a proto-feminist icon, scrubbing away the compromises and contradictions that made her human. The myths cling like cobwebs. That fabled Court of Love, where Eleanor allegedly presided over romantic disputes, pure 12th century fan fiction. Yet it still shapes how we see her, from video games like Civilization, where she's a cultural powerhouse bonus character, to Assassin's Creed's glamorized cameos. Even the image of her riding bare-breasted into the Crusades, immortalized in pre-Raphaelite paintings, likely sprang from a mistranslation of bareheaded in medieval texts. These distortions matter because they obscure her real genius, her mastery of soft power. The best adaptations grasp that Eleanor's power wasn't in grand gestures but in patient strategy. The BBC's Devil's Crown shows her quietly schooling Richard in Aquitanian politics, while Margaret Ball's Duchess of Aquitaine highlights her financial acumen during the ransom crisis. These glimpses honor what chroniclers missed, that her true legacy wasn't rebellion or romance but the art of endurance. She outlasted slander, captivity, and the men who sought to erase her, ensuring history would remember not just the queen, but the woman who refused to be written out of her own story. Eleanor of Aquitaine's legacy didn't end with her death. It was reborn in the 20th century, refashioned into a blazing emblem of female autonomy that resonates powerfully today. Feminist scholars and popular culture alike have seized upon her story, transforming a medieval queen into a symbol of resistance against patriarchal constraints. But this reclaiming isn't mere wishful thinking. It's rooted in the raw materials of her life, her divorces, her rebellions, her unapologetic exercise of power in a world determined to deny it to women. Historians like Amy Kelly and Alison Weir didn't just dust off old chronicles. They flipped the script, challenging centuries of dismissive narratives that painted Eleanor as either a shrew or a seductress. Their work revealed a woman who didn't merely survive a system designed to crush her, she bent it to her will. The parallels to modern women leaders are impossible to ignore. When Eleanor secured Aquitaine's sovereignty in her divorce from Louis, she set a precedent that echoes in contemporary battles for financial independence. Think of divorce settlements today where high-profile women fight to retain control of businesses or assets. Eleanor's insistence on keeping her birthright foreshadowed these struggles by nearly 900 years. Even her imprisonment reads differently through a feminist lens, not just as punishment but as proof of how threatening her autonomy was to Henry's rule. In an era when female politicians and CEOs still face disproportionate scrutiny, Eleanor's story feels chillingly familiar, a reminder that women who wield power have always been targets. Yet the feminist reclaiming of Eleanor isn't without controversy. Some scholars argue that projecting modern ideals onto a medieval figure risks distorting her reality. Eleanor didn't see herself as a feminist, a concept that wouldn't exist for centuries. Her actions were driven by dynastic survival, not gender equality. But this critique misses the point. What makes her resonate isn't an anachronistic purity test, it's the way she hacked the system she was born into. When she ruled Aquitaine independently or negotiated Richard's ransom, she wasn't advocating for all women's rights. Yet by merely existing as a woman who governed, strategized, and outmaneuvered kings, she expanded the imagination of what women could do. Popular culture has amplified this legacy, though not always accurately. Shows like The White Queen and books like Eleanor of Aquitaine, a life simplify her complexities but crystallize her as a proto-feminist icon. Even the flawed lion in winter depiction, for all its historical liberties, captures something true: her refusal to be sidelined. Meanwhile, politicians like Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel, women who balance leadership with motherhood in the public eye, unwittingly channel Eleanor's dual role as stateswoman and matriarch. When Merkel famously stared down male counterparts in EU negotiations, or Ardern navigated a pandemic while pregnant, they embodied the same unspoken message Eleanor projected: that competence needs no gender qualification. The most compelling modern parallel lies in Eleanor's mastery of narrative. Just as she patronized troubadours to shape her image, today's female leaders harness social media and speeches to control their stories. Beyoncé sampling Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's "We Should All Be Feminists" during performances, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez clapping back at sexist critics. These are acts of self-definition Eleanor would recognize. Both then and now, the battle isn't just for power, it's for the right to be seen as multifaceted. The monks who called Eleanor a witch and the trolls who attack women online share the same goal: reducing complexity to caricature. This reclaiming matters because it corrects a historical erasure. For too long, Eleanor's achievements were framed as exceptions, flukes of personality rather than evidence of systemic possibility. By recentering her story, we acknowledge that women have always been architects of history, even when the blueprints were burned. The firebrand duchess who smuggled messages from prison, who turned a ransom crisis into a masterclass in governance, who died surrounded by the books she cherished. She wasn't ahead of her time. She was proof that time has always held space for women's ambition, if we dare to look closely enough. 82 years of life, an odyssey that stretched from the sun-drenched vineyards of Aquitaine to the damp crypts of Fontevraud, yet Eleanor of Aquitaine never once let history dictate her pace. She wasn't just a passenger on the roller coaster of medieval power, she was its engineer, wrenching the tracks in directions no one else dared. Twice a queen, mother of kings, prisoner, regent, and cultural revolutionary, her story reads like a tapestry woven with golden threads and bloodstains, each frayed edge revealing another layer of defiance. Consider the whiplash turns of her legacy. One moment, she's the teenage duchess inheriting lands wealthier than kingdoms, forced into a marriage with a monkish boy king who couldn't comprehend her fire. The next, she's leading knights on crusade, her name dripping from the lips of scandalized clerics. Then came Henry, a marriage that ignited an empire spanning from Scotland to the Pyrenees, only to crumble into betrayal and 16 years of imprisonment. Yet, even locked away, she wasn't silenced. When the cage finally opened, she emerged not broken but sharper, steering Richard's reign from the shadows and outlasting every man who sought to control her. But Eleanor's true genius lay beyond crowns and battlefields. She reshaped Europe's imagination, turning her courts into laboratories for art and power. The troubadours she championed didn't just sing of love, they coded rebellion into verse, elevating women from political pawns to arbiters of loyalty. The Arthurian legends spun under her patronage weren't mere entertainment. They were blueprints for a world where queens wielded moral authority equal to kings. Even her fashion was a manifesto: scarlet silks and golden wimples that screamed sovereignty in a palette reserved for men. So here's the question that lingers like incense in a cathedral: was Henry's Angevin empire truly his, or did its bones belong to Eleanor? The lands that made it formidable were hers. Aquitaine, the jewel that outshone Normandy. The sons who fought for it were raised on her Occitan ideals of courtly power and razor-edged diplomacy. When Richard knelt to her after his release from captivity, was it filial piety or acknowledgement that without her fiscal wizardry and alliances, there'd have been no kingdom to return to? History loves to credit kings with building empires, but empires aren't just forged in battle. They're sustained through networks nurtured by patronage, defended with legal cunning. In every one of those arenas, Eleanor didn't just assist, she dominated. So before you answer, weigh the evidence. Who truly held the reins of the Plantagenet dynasty? The warlord who conquered, or the woman who outthought, outlasted, and outmaneuvered every constraint? The debate isn't just academic, it's a reckoning with how we measure power itself. Drop your verdict in the comments, but choose wisely. Eleanor's ghost has a way of winning arguments even 8 centuries later.